I would be very interested in hearing a social anthropologist explain the difference between the way Julia Roberts' portrayal of Erin Brockovich and her fight against Pacific Gas and Electric made Erin Brockovich a household name, and Meryl Streep's portrayal of Karen Silkwood, even with Cher and Kurt Russell in supporting roles, was a real sleeper. And I fear many of you now wouldn't even be able to remember who Karen Silkwood was. Maybe it was the difference of a generation. Silkwood was released in '83, Erin Brockovich in 2000. Or maybe it's the fact that Erin Brockovich is still alive, still doing environmental activism while Karen Silkwood is dead, apparently murdered by the corporation that she was investigating, Kerr-McGee Plutonium in Oklahoma. In my mind, both Karen Silkwood and Erin Brockovich were prophets in the sense that they stood up to power and spoke truth on behalf of poor people who were being abused. I'm reminded of that scene in the 7th chapter of Amos when Amos is confronted by the king of Israel, Amaziah, who told him to stop preaching in his city. And Amos replied, "I am neither a prophet nor the son of a prophet. I'm just a herdsman. I'm a farmer." To be a prophet doesn't mean you have to be like Gandhi or Martin Luther King. You don't have to have degrees or a powerful pulpit or a following of thousands. You just have to be willing to act in the presence of injustice to try to make it right. I was only 12 years old when Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. He was famous, he was handsome, he was rich, he was running for president, and he could very well have won. But at his funeral, his brother Teddy stood before more than 2,000 mourners, all dressed in black. And even as a child, I can remember hearing Teddy Kennedy say in the news, "My brother need not be idolized or enlarged in death beyond what he was in life, but he may be remembered simply as a good and decent man who saw wrong and tried to right it, saw suffering and tried to heal it, who saw war and tried to stop it." And while you have to appreciate the humility of this sentiment, I think we should idolize Bobby Kennedy and people like him, like Erin Brockovich and like Karen Silkwood, because they were good and decent people who saw wrong and tried to right it. Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. Karen Silkwood was apparently murdered. And realistically, I think we should be thankful that Erin Brockovich literally survived the stand that she took against Pacific Gas and Electric. Many such whistleblowers have not fared as well. Still, what I'm trying to emphasize today is not that what they did was right, whether they got Julia Roberts to play them or not. You do the right thing even if you're never noticed. It's always the right time to do the right thing. It's never okay to witness injustice and remain silent, either in the public or in the private sphere. A few whistleblowers become heroic legends, but most are lost to history, and many, almost against reason and justice, have languished in prison as their reward for doing what was right. Let me test your memory. Do you recognize this woman? In 2001, she was the vice president of Enron. She wrote a memo to Ken Lay, the CEO, about his use of fraudulent accounting practices that was successfully making Enron one of the largest and most lucrative corporations in America, but it was all a fraud. As soon as she spoke to Ken Lay about the use of illegal bookkeeping methods to steal money from investors, he called in the corporate attorneys to find out some legal means by which they could fire her. Sharon Watkins said that she counts herself among the more fortunate of whistleblowers because Enron was taken into bankruptcy before Ken Lay could exact the kind of corporate revenge that he was really planning. And you may recall This time it was Ken Lay who died just before he was sentenced to go to prison. Sharon was named Times Person of the Year that year and received a number of public accolades for her honesty and integrity. But you know what she didn't get was another job, because people tend to not like whistleblowers. She's sort of the Colin Kaepernick of CPAs. Lots of public applause and recognition, but no paycheck and no future. Not everyone who goes to the cross gets resurrected. Not everyone who takes a stand on justice receives praise. There's no statues to them. Most likely they got killed or they are forgotten. Others survive and are largely ignored, but that still doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. You know, reasonable people adapt themselves to the status quo. So any change that ever happens because someone became unreasonable. Someone decided to stand up to the system. What can be worse than what happened to some of these people is when you are a whistleblower against the government, because a lot of times that means you're going to go to prison. Like a lot of other white liberals, I spent one very cold week in a blizzard on Standing Rock Reservation in North Dakota, joining in on the protests of the Dakota Access Pipeline. I was there in December of 2017, and after one miserable week, I came home. But these 5 Native Americans were arrested during the protest, and they served or are still serving 4 to 6 years in prison for standing up to both the energy company and local law enforcement. They did things that were not done during the civil rights movements in the 50s and 60s. I went the week after they had trapped 200 Native Americans on a bridge in sub-freezing weather and sprayed them with fire hoses and left them out there for hours in the cold. Now, admittedly, all I took to the protest was a clerical collar, and some of these protesters took guns, and Red Fawn shot hers. But whatever their real crimes were, they were nothing in comparison to the crime of pumping toxic sludge from 2 miles under the ground in Canada and then sending it through pipes under the Missouri River and across Native American land, a pipeline that has already leaked a great deal, which is predictable. Pipelines leak. There were instances of property damage by the protesters against the construction company, but was that worse than what the construction company was doing to the environment? These things are not always equal, but you know, if you take the gospel account seriously, you can't really assume that Jesus is on your side when you insist that anyone can demonstrate, but destruction of property is unacceptable. Most of the New Testament gives us a fictionalized version of the life of Jesus, but one of the more historically defensible accounts was of Jesus violently cleansing the temple. That little Black Lives Matter riot is probably what really got Jesus arrested and killed. When all else fails in silencing the voice of a prophet, governments will almost always revert to the absurdly trumped-up charge of disturbing the peace. Challenging the status quo, disrupting business operations, that's what cost Socrates his life. And 400 years later, it cost Jesus his life. We could mark the trail of blood through the centuries of martyrs who died for daring to tell the inconvenient truth in an empire of lies. I think even about John Brown, that the abolitionist who was murdered for daring to fight for the freedom of slaves. People are now removing statues of Robert E. Lee, and even people I want to like are saying things like, well, you don't change history because you don't like it. Yeah, but you don't put up a statue to the perpetrator of the sin. Put up a statue to John Brown if you want a statue of somebody that deserves our praise. Folks, through the centuries, the names of empires change, but the lies tend to remain the same. they still praise the perpetrators of violence and injustice, and the people who stood up to them are forgotten. I took our wisdom lesson today from a clip from The Intercept about Daniel Hale's nearly 4-year-long sentence for revealing to the media that our military drone program was illegally targeting and assassinating civilians. Now, in his case, it happened in 2019. I'm afraid it happened again just last week, but sticking to Daniel Hale's story, it was under the Trump administration, and most of my friends, everybody I know, has gotten to a point where we almost placidly accept that Donald Trump would do anything immoral, illegal, unjust, if only he somehow got entertainment value or some personal benefit out of it. But as troubling as the case of Daniel Hale was, I don't think we should ever let ourselves forget about Chelsea Manning, who was also a military whistleblower, releasing files regarding war crimes committed by our troops to WikiLeaks. In both cases, the American government could not demonstrate harm from these leaks. I understand that leaking classified information is illegal, but if you're going to send someone to prison for years, shouldn't you be able to say that their crime actually resulted in harm? In both cases, they revealed war crimes, but none of the soldiers involved in murdering civilians were either prosecuted or punished. Hale got 4 years in prison. Manning was sentenced to 35 years, but her sentence was commuted after 7 years. 7 years! During which time she was often kept in solitary confinement, held naked and cold and nearly starving, being tortured, don't miss this point, by the government of the United States of America, under, this hurts, the direction of President Barack Obama. That part, folks, is hard for me to even make myself say. I know that Obama was not a progressive. I always knew that. In fact, he's a rather hawkish right-wing Democrat. But I always wanted to think of him as being fairly reliably logical, that he was a man who at heart is a decent person. But describing Obama as being a decent person is a pretty hard sell when you think about how Manning was treated. Manning provided video evidence of our military murdering civilians, journalists, and then when the medical first responders showed up to try to save the people who had been shot, they shot the medics. Then they called in a large military vehicle to run over the bodies repeatedly so that the bodies couldn't be identified. I ask you, would the Taliban do worse? Could Al-Qaeda be more evil than that? Why would we want to go and fight ISIS if we're no different from them? Those involved in these crimes, the soldiers involved, were not suspended, they were not discharged, they were not even demoted for the crimes that they committed. Chelsea Manning spent 7 years being tortured in an American prison, and today she is not free from government threats and harassment. She is constantly being threatened with parole violations for refusing to reveal more information about her associates in this affair. I'm not even going to mention Julian Assange. You can look that up if you go to our YouTube channel and just search for Julian Assange. I've talked about him. I've told you before how my reporting of my denominational officials for hiding sex crimes and stealing designated funds got me booted out of the Disciples of Christ. I'm not going to repeat that unless, of course, I write a tell-all one day, and you all know you want me to. What I know from personal experience and from history is that being a whistleblower is very unlikely to get you rewarded. One time someone was declared Times Person of the Year, but it's much more likely to get you fired and get you sued, make you unemployable for life. It could land you in prison. It might get you killed. But I still know this: it needs to be done. We don't tell hard truths to make ourselves seem to be more important at the expense of others. We don't raise a prophetic voice in order to be noticed. We do it to help make the world a better place. And we do it so that we do not become passive accomplices to the very worst evils in the world, whether they're committed by our enemies or by our friends or members of our own tribe. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "A time comes when silence is betrayal. Even when pressed by the demands of inner truth, men and women do not easily assume the task of opposing their government's policy, especially in a time of war, nor does the human spirit move without great difficulty against the apathy of conformist thought within one's own bosom and in the surrounding world. The burden of carrying the truth is almost always very heavy and nearly impossible to bear in the worst moments. And yet, folks, I'm imploring you, at your work, at your university, among your circle of friends, within your own family, you must not be silent." As I quoted George Bernard Shaw earlier, a reasonable person adapts themselves to the world. An unreasonable person persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends entirely on an unreasonable person showing up. Don't just go along with the injustices you encounter at work, in government, or dare I say, even among your best friends. Be the one who protects victims, who stands up for what is true and what is good and what is virtuous. My own experience is best summed up by the Boston novelist Alexander Jablokov, who said, "The road to truth is long, and it is lined the entire way with annoying bastards." Just don't let the bastards get you down.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.